I've been working as a food delivery driver for a couple of years now, and I've had my fair share of strange encounters, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was a Friday evening, around 9 p.m., and I had just picked up an order from a popular burger joint downtown. The delivery address was in a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, an area I wasn't too familiar with. As I approached the street, I noticed it was dimly lit, and the houses were spaced far apart, giving it an eerie, isolated vibe. When I reached the address, I was surprised to find it was an old, rundown house that looked abandoned. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the porch light was flickering. I double-checked the address and decided to ring the doorbell just in case. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and a man in his late 30s stood before me. He had a disheveled appearance with unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. There was something unsettling about his demeanor, but I tried to brush it off as just a rough day. "Hey man, I've got your order here," I said, holding up the bag of food. The man stared at me blankly for a few seconds before reaching out to take the bag. As he did, I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. "Thanks," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I was about to ask for the payment when he suddenly turned and disappeared back into the house, leaving the door wide open. Feeling uneasy, I decided to call out to him. "Sir, you haven't paid yet." There was no response, so I took a deep breath and stepped inside the house. The interior was even worse than the outside. The walls were cracked, and the floorboards creaked with every step. The air was thick with a musty, unpleasant odor that made me want to gag. "Hello, sir? I need to get paid for the delivery," I called out, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound coming from the back of the house. It sounded like someone crying or whimpering. My heart started racing, and a sense of dread washed over me. I followed the sound down a dimly lit hallway, trying to ignore the overwhelming feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I approached the end of the hall, I noticed a door slightly ajar, and the sound was coming from behind it. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open, and what I saw next will be seared into my memory forever. The room was small and cramped, with no windows and barely any furniture. In the center of the room, tied to a chair, was a young woman. Her face was bruised and swollen, and she had duct tape covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror as she looked up at me. In that split second, I knew I had stumbled upon a hostage situation, and my life was in grave danger. Without hesitating, I turned and ran as fast as I could towards the front door. "Hey, stop!" I heard the man's voice shouting from behind me. I didn't look back. I burst through the front door and kept running, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the man's footsteps behind me, growing closer and closer. Suddenly, something whizzed past my head, narrowly missing me. The man had thrown an object, likely trying to stop me from escaping. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys as I desperately tried to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sped away from that nightmare of a house. My hands were shaking violently as I drove, but I knew I had to call the police immediately. I pulled over at a gas station and dialed 911, relaying everything I had seen and heard. Within minutes, police officers arrived at the scene, and a tense standoff ensued. After what felt like hours, the man finally surrendered and was taken into custody. The woman was rescued, and it was later revealed that the man was her former boyfriend who had kidnapped her after she tried to leave him. He had been holding her captive for days, subjecting her to unspeakable torment. As for me, I was incredibly fortunate to have escaped unharmed. The experience left me shaken to my core, and I struggled with the trauma for a long time afterward. I eventually quit my job as a delivery driver, unable to shake the feeling of unease every time I approached an unfamiliar address. To this day, I can still vividly recall the image of that terrified woman, bound and helpless in that dark room. It's a haunting reminder of the evil that can lurk behind even the most unassuming facades, and how quickly an ordinary night can take a turn into a nightmare. This is a story that happened to me last year, when I was working as a food delivery driver for one of those apps. I'm not going to say which one because I don't want them coming after me or anything. Anyway, one night I got an order to deliver to this house way out in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking like 20 minutes outside of town down these empty back roads. The instructions said to call when I arrived since the house was so far off the main road. So I followed the GPS and it took me down this long, dark driveway through the woods to this big house sitting all alone. I pulled up and called the number like the instructions said. Some guy answered and just grunted, "Yeah," in this gravelly voice. I told him I was there with his food delivery. He said, "Come on up," and hung up. No other instructions, just that. I got out and grabbed the food from my warm bag. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed that despite the huge size of the house, there weren't any lights on except for one dim light coming through a window on the side. Strange for someone having food delivered to have their place so dark. I knocked on the big wooden front door a few times, but there was no answer. I could start to hear some muffled noises from inside though, like someone moving around. So I knocked again, louder. "Hello? Food delivery," I shouted. Suddenly, the door swung open and this massive guy was standing there squinting out at me. He was easily over 6 feet tall and had to weigh 300 pounds, all muscle. Kinda looked like one of those biker dudes with long graying hair and a big bushy beard. But the weird thing was he had these intense, wild-looking eyes that seemed too big for his head. He was just wearing a stained wife-beater shirt and dirty sweatpants. "You got my food?" He growled in this raspy voice. Yeah," I stammered, handing him the bag of containers. "That'll be $24.50. He just stared at me for an uncomfortably long time, not saying anything or moving to pay me. I started to get a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. The total is $24.50, sir," I said again, trying to stay calm and polite. That seemed to snap him out of his daze. "Oh, right, hang on." He disappeared back inside, leaving the door wide open. From where I was standing on the step, I could see into what looked like a big living room area. It was really dark, except for some flickering lights coming from an old tube TV sitting on the floor. The place was also a total mess. There were beer cans, food containers, and random junk just scattered everywhere. The guy came lumbering back a few moments later, still not saying anything. He roughly shoved some cash into my hand, not even counting it out or anything. Thanks," I said, quickly counting it to make sure it was enough. "You have a good night." I tried to hand him back the change, but he just grunted and waved me off, so I pocketed it and turned to leave. That's when I noticed another muffled sound coming from somewhere back inside the house. It almost sounded like a whimpering. That's when I felt another chill go down my spine. Just as I reached my car, I heard the guy say "hey" from behind me in that gravelly voice. I froze in my tracks, not wanting to turn around, but knowing I had to. "Yeah," I called back over my shoulder as calmly as I could. "You allergic to dogs?" No, sir, no allergies," I replied, now feeling really confused in addition to creeped out. "Good, be careful driving home." With that, he slammed the front door shut with a heavy thud, leaving me standing there alone in the dark. I hauled ass out of there as fast as I could, tires kicking up dirt and gravel behind me. All the way driving back into town, I kept replaying that whole encounter over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. The more I thought about it, the more it really started to freak me out. Why was that place such a mess? Why was he being so weird and hostile? And who was that whimpering noise coming from back inside? It started to really eat away at me over the next few days. The more I thought about his final comments about having a dog and driving home carefully, the darker my mind wandered. I started to get the terrible image that maybe he did something to someone and was warning me about his dog in case it attacked me or something. I tried to force it out of my mind, telling myself I was just being paranoid and letting my imagination run wild. But it kept gnawing away at me until I finally broke down and told a friend about the whole experience while we were out at a bar one night. My friend is the type who's always watching those true crime shows, so he was instantly intrigued and convinced me to report it to the police. He kept saying things like, "What if there's someone being held hostage there?" Or, "What if there's a body stashed in that house?" And as crazy as it sounds, it really started to weigh on my mind to the point where I felt I had to let the cops know, just in case. I went down to the station the next day and gave them the details, the address, a description of the guy, how it was all just a gut feeling, but his behavior really set off alarm bells for me. To their credit, The officers actually took me seriously. They said they'd log it and do a drive-by of the property, just to check things out and be sure everything looked okay from the outside. A couple days passed and I tried to just go about my regular routine, putting the whole thing out of my head, until I got a call from one of the officers I'd spoken to. He said that when they went by the property, they immediately noticed something really suspicious. A pair of human foot tracks in the mud leading up to an old, run-down barn way behind the main house. Upon further inspection, they found disturbing signs of some kind of struggle back there, including blood smeared on the walls and what looked like drag marks across the dirt floor. They immediately went and got a search warrant. What they uncovered when they finally searched the entire property was even worse than any of us could have imagined. I don't want to go into too many of the gory details, but from what the police told me, that place was basically a psychopath's playhouse. There was a whole other house hidden way back in the woods that he'd turned into his own private torture chamber. They found all kinds of sick instruments of torture and restraint devices, and remains, dozens of bodies at different stages of decay, some appearing to have been kept alive for God knows how long based on the state they were in. Turns out this guy had been snatching people, primarily loners and runaways that no one would miss right away, and bringing them back to his place for, well, you can imagine the kind of unspeakable twisted games that kind of psycho would put them through. The cops said it was one of the most depraved, nightmare-inducing cases of serial murder they had ever seen. They nicknamed the guy the Butcher because of how barbarically mutilated most of the bodies were. I'll never be able to shake the image of that house in my mind, or the thought that if I just minded my own business and didn't listen to my gut feeling, he would have kept doing what he was doing to who knows how many more innocent people. The worst part is wondering if that whimpering sound was actually coming from some poor soul he had imprisoned and was keeping alive for his sick torture games. It makes me sick to my stomach just thinking about it. I still have nightmares about showing up to deliver that food order and opening the door to a whole room of people trapped in cages or strung up on racks, screaming for help. Anyway, that's my scary true story about working a food delivery job. I quit that same day and took a nice, safe office job afterwards. Some scars you just can't unsee, though. Getting that What to Do About Your Inner Nightmare self-help book for my next birthday. This happened to me a few weeks ago and I'm still kind of freaked out by it. I do food delivery for one of the apps, picking up orders from restaurants and dropping them off at people's houses. It's an okay gig. The money isn't great, but the hours are flexible. Anyways, I got this order around 8 p.m. to pick up from a burger place and deliver to a house on the other side of town. Not too far, maybe a 15-20 minute drive. I get to the burger place, pick up the food, and put the address into my GPS. It was taking me into one of the newer housing developments on the outskirts of the city, one of those areas where all the houses look brand new. I pull up to the address and it's a decent-sized 2-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac. Lots of lights on inside, which is good because I hate when people order food and don't have any exterior lights on. Makes it hard to find the place at night. There were no cars in the driveway or on the street, but I figure they're probably just all parked in the garage. I grab the food and head up to the front door, ringing the doorbell. After a minute of no answer, I ring it again. Still nothing. I'm about to knock when I hear some muffled thumping sounds coming from inside. Okay, cool. I think somebody's coming to the door. The thumping gets a little louder, like somebody stomping around inside toward the entryway. Then this blood-curdling scream suddenly rips through the door, a woman screaming at the top of her lungs like she's being murdered. I damn near dropped the food right there. My heart was pounding out of my chest. The screaming doesn't stop, just goes on and on and on in this horrific wail. My first thought was that I needed to get out of there. Every instinct was telling me to just book it back to my car and drive away as fast as possible. But then I think, what if somebody really does need help in there? What if some lunatic is attacking or killing someone? I shouldn't just run away. I should call the cops at least. So I'm standing there frozen on the doorstep, completely paralyzed, looking around for somewhere to take cover in case a window busts open or a door flies open and whatever's going on inside comes pouring out. But the screaming just keeps going on in this continuous loop, never stopping for a breath and never breaking. Just this insane primal shriek. That's when I start noticing something off about it. It almost sounds artificial or like it's being played through a speaker. There's no variation, no gasping for air in between, just this robotic, endless wail. That's also when I realize there are no other sounds. No furniture being knocked over, no human-sounding grunts of struggle, nothing. At this point, the screaming is still just as loud and steady as when it started. It was pretty clear that either this screaming woman was a robot, or this whole thing was some kind of weird recording or prank being played through the house's surround sound system or something. I figure the only way I'm going to find out what the heck is going on is to try knocking on the door instead of just ringing the bell. So I set the food down, take a couple steps back for safety, then pound as hard as I can on the front door yelling, "Hello? Can anybody hear me?" As soon as I do that, the screaming cuts off like somebody flipped a switch. Dead silence. I stand there for a few seconds, utterly confused. Then from somewhere inside I hear a dude's voice, kind of low and monotone, say, "Oh, sorry man, let me get that for you." More weird artificial sounding thumping noises like footstep sound effects, and then the door swings open. This scrawny guy is standing there, early 20s probably, wearing a greasy bathrobe and slippers. He takes one look at me, frozen in fear on his porch, and bursts out laughing. This really unsettling, wheezing cackle. "Oh man, did my lil sound system get you good?" He chuckles again, then proceeds to grab the food from me without another word, not even a thank you, and shuts the door in my face. I still don't even know what to make of the whole thing. Was it an audio prank? Some kind of disturbing sound experiment? I thought about calling the cops to check on the guy, but he seemed lucid enough, and I was so eager to get out of there I didn't even consider it at the time. Just hopped in my car and peeled out as fast as I could. Looking back, the whole thing was equal parts terrifying and deeply, deeply unsettling. The newfound realization of how easily a person could use sound effects to make you think somebody was being assaulted or murdered was bad enough. But something about the way that guy answered the door, that dead-eyed look and weird maniacal cackle when he saw I was shaken up, it's haunted me ever since. I never delivered to that house again, and I sure as hell never will. It's a good reminder of all the freaks and weirdos that are out there, I guess. People with some serious issues that you never want to cross paths with. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but I can't help but feel I narrowly avoided getting mixed up with one of those disturbed individuals. And for that, I'm grateful.